What would you say if I told you that a lending protocol could become one of the biggest decentralized exchanges on Ethereum? Well, believe it or not, it's not a what if anymore, because it is exactly what Fluid has achieved by becoming the number 2 DEX on the entire network. The secret lies in a new paradigm referred to as DEX on lending, or what Fluid calls smart collateral and smart debt. To really understand this, however, we can't just look at Fluid's DEX in isolation. Instead, we really need to understand the whole product suite of Fluid, because as you'll see, these different components are tightly linked together. The goal of this video series is to unpack the whole system for you. So first, we'll look at the foundational liquidity layer that powers every Fluid application that is built on top. That is Fluid Lending, Fluid Vault, and Fluid DEX. First, we'll be looking at Fluid Lending and see how it achieves the highest yields within DeFi. Then we'll be looking at Fluid Vault, which is Fluid's borrowing protocol. And more specifically, we'll deep dive into the core mechanics behind its liquidation mechanism, because it's this liquidation engine that enables Fluid to offer the highest loan-to-value ratios and the lowest liquidation penalties within all of DeFi. And finally, we'll see how it all fits together within Fluid DEX and deep dive into the core concept of smart collateral and smart debt to truly understand how they work under the hood. Also, just to be clear, my goal here is not to drag you through every line of code of Fluid's code base. Instead, I really want to give you a good understanding of Fluid's architecture, the advantages that come from its modular design, and the various financial advantages that these various mechanisms create for end users. That being said, however, I think the Fluid Smart Contract code base is a must read for every DeFi developer out there. Anyway, with that being said, let's dive into it. Right, so let's get started with the Fluid Liquidity Layer. And as I already said, everything in the Fluid ecosystem is underpinned by this universal liquidity layer, which you can look at as a foundational smart contract that every application in Fluid is built on top of. Currently, as I already mentioned, that is Fluid Lending, Fluid Vault, which I haven't even drawn here, and Fluid DEX, and soon Fluid DEX V2 will be added to that product suite. But in theory, anyone could build a protocol on top as long as it's approved by governance. So as I already said, the focus of this liquidity layer really is to be simple, but to be central in order to provide these liquidity network effects to all the various applications that are built on top of it. And all the complex logic, borrowing, lending, swapping, and so on, is not sitting within the Fluid liquidity layer, but is pushed downstream to these applications. Then this liquidity layer only has a couple of responsibilities. First of all, and importantly, it custodies all of the token balances for all of the applications. Then it tracks debt and supply balances of every application. And importantly, it sets interest rates and keeps track of accruals to these exchange prices. And also importantly, it imposes some security limits that, for example, prevent sudden large changes in reserves that could be triggered by some external logic. Right, so how does this liquidity layer communicate with these applications? First off, the liquidity layer exposes this operate method, which is kind of the single entry point method that allows the application to deposit into it, to withdraw from it, to borrow from it, and to repay into it. And second, any application that builds on the Fluid liquidity layer needs to implement this iProtocol interface, which only requires it to implement this liquidity callback method, which the liquidity layer calls within the operate method. And often that is only to handle token transfers, for example. So if you want to build an application on top of Fluid's liquidity layer, all you got to do is implement this iProtocol interface. And of course, you need to be approved by governance. And governance checks whether you are beneficial for the Fluid ecosystem and if your application is secure, of course. Currently, there are only Fluid in-house applications like Fluid Lending, Fluid DEX, and Fluid Vault, and soon Fluid DEX V2 that are built on top of the Fluid liquidity layer. But I'm pretty sure that in the future, we'll see third parties building on top of this liquidity layer, because the advantages to compose with it are huge, because applications can focus on the core mechanisms of the application, whereas they don't have to worry about bootstrapping liquidity. We're all aware of these new lending protocols that struggle to bootstrap liquidity because they face this classic chicken and egg problem where lenders don't come if there are no borrowers, and borrowers don't come if there are no lenders and nothing to borrow from. So usually this is solved by expensive liquidity mining campaigns that are costly to the lending protocol. And what I really like about this design is that this fluid liquidity layer that is central to everything is kind of creating this flywheel effect where the more applications that build on top of it, the higher the utilization rates of these assets, and through extension, the higher the interest rates. And these interest rates in turn lead to more lenders and more capital to flow into the liquidity layer, which in turn leads to more applications, and so on and so on. Amazing. So now that we understand the basic fluid liquidity layer, let's look at the first and simplest product that is built on top of it, which is fluid lending. And the user experience is really as smooth as it gets. It's very simple. You deposit one asset, USDC for example, and you earn passive yield. And within the UI, you'll find it under the Lend tab. In my opinion, what sets fluid lending really apart is that it automatically taps into all the borrow demand that originates from any protocol that taps into the central liquidity layer. So currently that is Fluid Vault, which is Fluid's borrowing protocol, and Fluid DEX. But in the future, it could be any other protocol that builds on top of this liquidity layer. And all of this borrow demand obviously leads to higher utilization rates and therefore translates into higher interest rate. And that is one of the reasons why fluid lending currently offers one of the most competitive yields within the DeFi space. So under the hood, the way fluid lending works is that it's implemented as an ERC-4626 yield-bearing token called F token, which exposes the single operate method that acts as an entry point for the user to make deposits and withdrawals. So when the user deposits, he receives his fair share of the F tokens, and that deposit gets routed via the operate method into the fluid liquidity layer. The fluid liquidity layer then updates exchange prices that take into account time elapsed and current interest rates and so on. And then it also makes this call back into the F token via the liquidity callback method that we saw earlier that has to be implemented by any application that plugs into the liquidity layer. And within fluid lending, this liquidity callback then handles token transfers. Basically, it transfers tokens directly from the user into the liquidity layer in the case of a deposit. So at the end of this flow, the user ends up with these F token shares that increase in value over time through yield that is tracked by these exchange prices that are maintained by the liquidity layer. And again, these exchange prices are basically indexes that track accruals since inception. They are very similar to the liquidity index as it's being called under the Aave protocol. And yeah, I think this really already sums it up for fluid lending. There's not much more to say. It's simple but powerful. It kind of offloads all the complexity and heavy lifting to external applications that plug into the liquidity layer. And yeah, so this decoupling, it automatically benefits from all the borrow demand without users ever having to migrate, which is very different to being a lender at Aave, for example. If you've been a user in Aave v2, when Aave migrated to Aave v3, you had to actively migrate yourself in order to benefit from the borrow demand that originated from Aave v3. Fluid lending users never have to migrate. As new protocols get added, they automatically benefit from this new borrow demand, which is really DeFi composability done right, in my opinion. Right, so this sums it up for fluid lending. And next up is the Fluid Vault protocol, which is Fluid's borrow application, so to say. You will be able to find it under the borrow tab within the UI. And yeah, it's basically a vault system where you are able to deposit one asset and borrow another asset against it. For example, you deposit ETH and you borrow USDC against it. The main thing that we want to focus on in Fluid Vault is its unique liquidation mechanism, because this is the single element that sets it apart from competition. So in order to understand it, you need to know that in theory, borrow protocols face a trade-off. They always want to offer high capital efficiency to their borrowers through high LTV, but they also want to minimize the risk of accruing bad debt. And the risk of bad debt and high loan-to-value ratios is obviously very positively correlated. Well, Fluid Vault essentially challenges this trade-off with a very novel and efficient liquidation engine that allows it essentially to offer higher loan-to-value ratios given a certain risk of bad debt. Before we want to dive into the mechanics of this liquidation mechanism, I just want to highlight some numbers to put things into perspective. So currently, Fluid Vault offers loan-to-value ratios of up to 87% for uncorrelated pairs. Say you deposit ETH and you borrow USDC against it. And loan-to-value ratios of up to 98% of correlated pairs. So say you deposit USDC and you borrow USDT. And the second statistic to point out here is liquidation penalties, which go as low as 0.1% on Fluid Vault. And this is a stark contrast to other borrowing protocols where liquidation penalties lie between 5 and 10%. So from a borrower's perspective, there's really no better place to borrow on than on Fluid Vault. Right, so this may sound too good to be true, so let's actually look into the innovation that makes all of this possible. Right, so let's dive into this liquidation machine. So as you can already guess here, the liquidation engine is very much inspired by Uniswap's V3 tick system. And if you watch this video, you're probably familiar with how Uniswap V3 breaks down these price ranges into these discrete ticks. Well, Fluid doesn't break down price ranges into ticks, but it breaks down debt to collateral ratios into ticks. So each tick here represents a given debt to collateral ratio to which positions get assigned to. To clarify this, let's come up with an easy number example. Say you deposit 2 ETH into the ETH USDC Fluid Vault and you borrow 3,000 USDC against it, where ETH currently quotes at a price of 2,000 USDC. Well, that would correspond to a ratio of 75%. You plug that ratio into this formula and you solve for the tick, and that is the tick to which this given position gets assigned to, say tick 200. And each of these ticks aggregates all the positions that correspond to the given debt to collateral ratio. Now, another important parameter that is configured differently for each Fluid Vault is this liquidation threshold tick. And currently the ETH USDC vault on mainnet, I think, has a liquidation threshold of 92% and not 90%. But beyond this loan to value ratio, liquidations would basically start to be triggered. One challenge here, of course, is that the debt to collateral ratio to which a position initially is being assigned to and its corresponding tick is constantly changing over time. It changes because of two factors. One is, of course, the underlying exchange prices of the liquidity layer, because your debt pays interest and your collateral pays interest as well. But that interest rate differs, and hence your debt to collateral ratio changes over time. The second is, of course, that the price of ETH relative to USDC in our example also changes. And hence this debt to collateral ratio constantly evolves. And the way that Fluid manages to manage this dynamic price environment is through this liquidation tick threshold that constantly changes. So say, for example, the price of ETH relative to USDC drops, then that would translate into our liquidation threshold tick effectively moving down and making all the ticks beyond that liquidation threshold and their corresponding positions liquidatable. So whenever we are in such a state here, then the liquidate method on the vault can be called. And what the liquidate method effectively does is that it loops from the most risky tick down to the liquidation threshold tick and liquidates just enough collateral from all these unhealthy ticks to merge them with the closest healthy tick. After the liquidation, we then end up in a state that looks something like that, where all the unhealthy ticks have been merged into this healthy tick. And the fact that Fluid liquidates just enough collateral to make your position healthy again is how we come to this 0.1% liquidation penalty. Because even if the liquidation penalty of a given vault is set at 1%, if only 10% of the actual collateral needs to be liquidated for a position to become healthy again, then that means that the loss to the user is only 10% of 1%, which is 0.1% effectively. All right, so what's the point of all of this? Well, the main reason here is that this tick-based system brings extreme efficiency into the liquidation process because it only operates on these ticks instead of operating on individual positions. And this is very similar to how Uniswap v3 is extremely efficient by routing trades only through ticks instead of these thousands of individual positions whose ranges include the current spot price. Similarly, Fluid's liquidation mechanism only liquidates ticks that aggregate potentially thousands of positions. And as a consequence, the gas costs associated with fluid liquidation scale approximately at O of 1 instead of O of n, which is most typical for most lending protocols like Aave, for example, where liquidators have to liquidate every individual position. Because I believe that this liquidation mechanism is so paramount to Fluid, I want to pause here and help to create a little mental model around it so that it sticks better. In order to do this, I came up with this mountain analogy that I posted on X some time ago. Within that mountain analogy, higher altitudes correspond to higher, riskier ticks with higher debt to collateral ratios. Now, the liquidation tick threshold, as we've seen before, can be viewed as this altitude level after which you end up in avalanche territory. The analogy with regards to this avalanche territory within Fluid's liquidation mechanism would then be being in a tick that is beyond the liquidation threshold tick as we have seen it before. Now, when it comes to these individual campers that allocate at various altitudes, you can think of these as individual positions within Fluid's vault protocol. As in, when a position gets created, it gets assigned to a certain tick that represents a given debt to collateral ratio. The same way here, individual campers live within a given altitude level that represents a tick in our system. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that we have all these positions within Fluid, or these campers on the mountain, whose state is fixed. They are allocated to given altitudes, or if you're a position, you are allocated to a given tick that corresponds to a given debt to collateral ratio. But the system kind of needs to capture the dynamic nature of the debt to collateral ratio of all these positions and ticks. Because as we've seen, prices evolve. And for example, if the price of the debt asset increases in value relative to the price of the collateral asset, the debt to collateral ratio of every position deteriorates in the system. And as we've seen, the way Fluid's liquidation mechanism makes sure it identifies everything that needs to be liquidatable is by making this liquidation threshold tick evolve. And the analogy to the mountain here and this dynamic environment would be a rising sea level, where the rising sea would represent a deterioration in the debt to collateral ratio. Or if we look at our prior example where we borrowed USDC against ETH, it would be a drop in the ETH price. So let's run this little animation here. So we see that sea levels rise, and as a result, the campers on this mountain need to reallocate to higher altitudes. In the same way that within Fluid, a drop in the price of the collateral asset leads the ticks to be pushed beyond the liquidation tick threshold. So as we can see here, some campers have been pushed so high up that they are within avalanche territory. And this would be synonymous to some ticks and their corresponding positions being pushed beyond the liquidation tick threshold and being subject to liquidation. So now here you can see that the liquidate method is called, or the avalanche hits, and we can see that some campers are being reallocated from the danger zone back into a safe altitude territory. And this post-liquidation state is similar to Fluid, where positions don't get fully liquidated, but instead only partially liquidated. And here you can think of these two campers that have been reallocated, of having just lost one leg instead of being completely wiped out and dead, so to say. So the last thing maybe worth mentioning here before wrapping up the Fluid Vault protocol is that each vault is being deployed through a vault factory. In our example, we mostly talked about the ETH USDC vault, and individual positions within that vault get actually stored as NFTs within that vault factory contract, and that goes for every vault that is being deployed. So all NFTs actually fit within the vault factory contract. While the NFT is within the Vault Factory contract, the actual position data that contains stuff like the tick that this position is being assigned to is being stored on the vault level. This is a good moment to pause and wrap up part 1 of this Fluid video series. So just to recap, what have we seen? We've seen what the Fluid Liquidity Layer is all about. Then we deep dived into Fluid Lending and saw how it consistently achieves these high yields. Then we deep dived into Fluid Vault and specifically looked at how the inner mechanics of its liquidation mechanism functions. We're now in a perfect position to attack Fluid DEX, and this is exactly what we're going to do in part 2. So let's continue with that.